One of the most visible aspects of the Cold War, the period of geopolitical tension and proxy warfare between the West and the USSR that lasted from 1947 to 1991, was what was known as the space race. And in the early decades of the Cold War, it certainly seemed as though it was the Soviet Union who were the ones who were winning the space race. The world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, was successfully launched into orbit in 1957, and by 1961 the USSR had put a man into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. Part of the reason for the earlier Soviet success was the focus put on the development of rockets with longer ranges that could carry heavier payloads. The primary factor for this was, of course, not simply just to win the space race, but to have nuclear missiles that were capable of intercontinental travel. To this end, the Soviets wanted, indeed they felt they needed, not only long-range missiles, but missiles that could be primed and ready for launch at a very short notice. And right there was the rub. The workhorse of the Soviet rocket program, the R-7, the rocket that had put Sputnik into orbit, had been designed and built to deliver a nuclear warhead to US soil, but it had one very big problem. It took a long time to get ready for launch. Now, this problem stemmed from the type of fuel that the rocket used, cryogenically cooled liquid oxygen. Using liquid oxygen necessitated the use of complex fueling and storage systems, and preparation time for an R-7 launch was measured in days, not in minutes. The Soviets needed a long-range missile which could be stored, fully fueled, and ready for launch. The name assigned to this new missile was the R-16. Now, the concept of the R-16 as a successor to the R-7 had been proposed as early as 1956, but due to the involvement of numerous committees and the inevitable bureaucratic red tape, the project was slow in getting off the ground. Nonetheless, due to the strategic importance of the R-16, the man placed in charge of the program was the high-ranking Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces of the USSR. He reported directly to the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Now, here's a perfect example of how politics and science don't always make for happy bedfellows. Nedelin was under enormous pressure to deliver a working version of the R-16, and Khrushchev's bold assertion to the United Nations that the Soviet Union was producing rockets like sausages from a machine probably didn't do anything to alleviate the stress of providing the Soviet Premier with the spectacle of a successful launch. Indeed, Nedelin himself upped the ante, declaring that the launch date be brought forward to coincide with the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. In order to try and accomplish this, chief designer Mikhail Yangel and his team worked around the clock, and, to nobody's surprise, the work became sloppy, rushed, and safety regulations were sometimes ignored. Now, in order to get around the problem of the long fueling time, Yangel and the R-16 design team had opted to use a hypergolic fuel system. In this system, two components, the propellant and the oxidizer, are chemically reactive to one another. All that was needed to precipitate a launch is for two liquids to come into contact with one another, and chemistry would do the rest. Using the hypergolic system, the R-16 could be fueled and ready for launch in as little as an hour, and a fully fueled and prepped R-16 could remain on standby for up to 3 days before the corrosive oxidant needed to be pumped back out. The fuel that was selected for use in the R-16 was unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, oxidized with a combination of nitrogen tetroxide and nitric acid. Highly corrosive, highly toxic, and producing poisonous gas when burned, this fuel combination was nicknamed the Devil's Venom by the technicians who worked on the rocket. By October 1960, the various components of the R-16 had been delivered to the Baikonur Cosmodrome, and Yangel's team of technicians and engineers scrambled to get the rocket into one piece to comply with Nedelin's advanced launch date. Even as technical problems with the flight control system continued to plague the rocket, it was moved from the assembly hangar out to the launch pad number 41 on the 21st of October. At this point, the fueling process began. Now, under normal circumstances, the launch pad and the immediate area around the rocket would have been evacuated of all non-essential crew. but due to the numerous problems that were still unresolved, the whole area was busy with personnel. An estimated 150 people remained in or around the rocket, including Marshal Nedelin himself, who apparently had set up a deck chair right there on the launch pad to personally supervise the final preparations. The next couple of days passed with a series of mishaps and problems, all of which served to delay any possible launch, and piled even more stress upon the heads of the already exhausted crew. On the 23rd of October, the first accident occurred. Explosive squibs used to rupture the membranes which separated the hypergolic fuel were blown in order to prep the rocket for launch. However, instead of rupturing the first stage membranes, the wrong squibs blew, rupturing the second stage membranes, and this then precipitated a series of corrosive leaks from the fuel lines. These leaks damaged the control system for the fuel mixer valves, and the whole system was so compromised that it needed to be replaced. Now, this meant draining all the propellant, and another day would have been lost. Nedelin stubbornly refused to drain the propellant, ordering the engineers to carry out the repair work on the rocket whilst it was still fully fueled, angrily shouting out that there would be no time for such things in a nuclear war. Now, right at this point, some Soviet top brass arrived at Baikonur to see for themselves the launch of the R-16. Upon learning of the delay, Khrushchev apparently was straight on the phone from Moscow and wasted no time in ripping into Nedelin, demanding to know why the R-16 wasn't ready and what the hell he was going to do about it. Despite the numerous unresolved technical problems and the near miss the day before, the R-16 was set to launch the following day, Monday, October the 24th. A viewing platform had been erected some 800 metres away from the launch pad where the VIPs would get a front seat view of the long-awaited spectacle. Despite these being the last few hours before launch, there were reportedly still around 250 personnel swarming around the rocket, desperately trying to remedy all the small fuel leaks and other technical issues which were still present. Upon hearing of yet another 30-minute delay, Nedelin, who had been on the VIP stand, insisted on going back down to the launch pad to, in his own words, figure out just what is going on. His deck chair was put back in its usual place at the edge of the launch pad, and there he sat, supervising the work and barking out orders to his subordinates. Remember, at this point, the second stage membranes in the upper part of the rocket had already been blown, and there was only one valve keeping the hypergolic fuel from entering the combustion chamber. At 6:45 p.m, about 30 minutes before the scheduled launch, a technician in the command bunker noticed that, following earlier tests, the valve control switch had been left in the wrong position. "Shall I move it to 0? He asked a colleague. "Yes, go ahead," came the reply. The technician rotated the switch, inadvertently sending the signal to launch, the fuel valves opened, and the second stage engine roared into life. The ignition of the second stage engine ripped open the huge first stage fuel tank directly beneath, and the entire launch pad, still milling with crew members, was instantly engulfed in a huge fireball. The 3,000-degree toxic fireball killed almost everyone in close proximity instantly, and anyone who was unfortunate enough to survive the initial blast was doomed to suffer a minute or two of agony as they ran away from the inferno, most of them completely ablaze. Cameras set to record automatically as the rocket launched captured the terrible scene. One surviving eyewitness recalled, "A thick stream of fire unexpectedly burst forth, covering everyone around. Part of the military contingent and testers instinctively tried to flee from the danger zone. People ran toward the bunker, but on this route was a strip of new-laid tar, which immediately melted. Many got stuck in the hot, sticky mess and became victims of the fire. The most terrible fate befell those located on the upper levels of the gantry. The people were wrapped in fire and burst into flame like candles blazing in mid-air. The temperature at the centre of this fire was about 3,000 degrees. Those who had run away tried while moving to tear off their burning clothing, their coats and overalls. Alas, many did not succeed in doing this." In the aftermath, intense fires raged for around 2 hours until finally they were brought under control. After the fires had been extinguished, all the bodies were in unique poses. All were without clothes or hair. It was impossible to recognise anybody. Almost all the bodies were burned beyond recognition, and yet it was clear that amongst the dead was Marshal Nedelin and a whole host of top-level names from the Soviet space program. The chief designer, Mikhail Yangel, survived. Luckily for him, he and a couple of others had nipped off to smoke a cigarette behind the command bunker just a minute before the rocket blew up. In the midst of the Cold War, the Nedelin disaster, as it became known, was hushed up to save face. Soviet news reported that Nedelin had died in a plane crash, and relatives of the others killed were advised to say the same thing. Although the CIA suspected that so many prominent Soviet space pioneers all dying at the same time was the result of a failed rocket launch, the case remained shrouded in mystery until after the fall of the Soviet Union, when the story of the Nedelin disaster was finally declassified. However, the final death toll of the R-16 explosion remains unclear to this day. Estimates range anywhere from 90 to as high as 300, although the most commonly accepted figure seems to be around 125 fatalities, with 50 more people badly wounded. The R-16 was finally put into military service in 1963, but it was decommissioned just over a decade later as part of the SALT I Treaty. In one final note, the Nedelin disaster and the loss of so many of the pioneers of the Soviet rocket program was a major factor in Khrushchev's risky decision to send short-range nuclear missiles to Cuba in 1963. And that was an event which took this planet to the brink of a full-scale nuclear war.